constellation deep dive into Capricornus on episode 358 of the Actual Astronomy Podcast. I'm Chris, and joining me is Shane. We are amateur astronomers who love looking up the night sky, and this podcast is for everybody who likes going out under the stars. So, Shane, tell us about the talk you attended last night.
Yeah, so the local club here, the Regina Center for the Royal Astronomical Society, had David Levy on, and he joined remotely from his home in, is it Vail? I think California, I think is where he resides.
I thought he was in Arizona.
Or maybe it's Arizona, Vail, Arizona. I don't know. But regardless, he was there. He didn't have slides. He just gave us a lecture on Carolyn Shoemaker and like his relationship with Carolyn and her husband Gene. And it was just fascinating because it was a very personal talk about them observing together and discovering comets together. And you could just tell there was a real strong friendship there, and it was just a very enlightening talk. One of the cool things too is David has like a lot of his his telescopes and various other things still with him, and one of the things he showed us was the original film that captured or led to the discovery of Shoemaker-Levy 9, which was the famous comet that crashed into Jupiter and left some markings behind that Hubble imaged and really captivated the astronomy world during that event.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Neat.
And then you attended, I think, a talk as well on Friday night, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. But just to comment on David, he's a fascinating person. I got to spend a whole weekend, actually like a long weekend, 3 days with him once. Sort of by sort of weird chance, we were going to the one of the early Jasper Dark Sky festivals, and he was going to be the keynote speaker. And everybody had piled into this sort of, it was this loud kind of rickety van, and because I had thought once we got up to Jasper that maybe I would rent a vehicle, and as we were driving up in this like rickety van, I was like, oh, this thing is just like loud, and it's going to be like this 3-hour drive. And I asked the guy, can I rent a vehicle when I get up there? He said no. So I said, well, let me off at the next stop, I got to go. And I was like frantically like trying to rent a vehicle like on my phone, and so I did get one, and I ended up driving up just by myself to Jasper. But when I got up there, nobody had a car. Like they had sort of a little bit of an oversight with how they were going to get the speakers around. So then suddenly I became like everybody's best friend kind of thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, I ended up driving David around because I kind of wanted to go observing and see some stuff. So he and I took our binoculars and we went like and drove around to like the observing sites in Jasper. And one day we drove up to I forget the name of the glacier, but there's like a famous glacier up there. We drove up there one afternoon and just talked astronomy and about like some of the mutual people we knew and some of his astronomy adventures over the years. So anyway, I just throwing that out there. It was kind of a neat experience to kind of get at his sort of background and interest in astronomy, and as because of that, we ended up eating breakfast and a lot of our meals and that together too. So because unless you wanted to eat wherever they had sort of stuck us, you needed a car to kind of get anywhere else. So anyway, it was kind of neat and get to know some of the other people there as well. It was pretty cool.
Oh, that's awesome.
Let's see. Yeah, so I went to the KWRESC Center meeting last night virtually by Zoom because I don't know if Regina Center is still doing this or not, but the KW Center has decided to keep doing both Zoom and in-person meetings. So I think most people were attending in person, but then if you're remote, you can choose to join by Zoom, which I did a few times, like during the middle of the pandemic when a friend or somebody was speaking, because I used to live in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, where the KW Center of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada is. But I just found like so much Zoom time during the pandemic. I just didn't have any more capacity for it. I don't know about you. Even astronomy, I was just like, oh, it's just too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Regina Center is still doing both. you can join via Zoom or in person. And I think that's great because with the Regina Center, it's really not just Regina; it's kind of southern Saskatchewan,
Hmm.
and it gives a lot of people an opportunity to attend that otherwise wouldn't be able to just due to the distance to from where they are to get to Regina. And I joined via Zoom as well. I just it's such a nice thing on a Friday night. Usually after the work week, I'm a little exhausted, and sometimes I just don't. Sometimes the barrier to attending these meetings is just driving there
Yeah.
because it is on the other side of the city. So, being able to sit on my couch and just join that way. And then, the other thing I like about it is if it's going to be a good night to observe, while the talk is going on, sometimes I'm setting up my equipment as well and getting ready for astronomy. I didn't do that on this Friday, but I do like that option of remote attendance.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, that's how I had intended to join was because I thought I would be out here, and then for a variety of reasons, we didn't even end up, getting ourselves together to get out here on Friday evening. So it was nice just to be able to join and kind of even went out at one point and like ran an errand, sort of between speakers when they did a break and that sort of stuff. So it's a little bit easier to fit it in. That said, though, I do much prefer sort of the in person stuff versus joining by Zoom. But yeah, when I was back in Ontario back in the spring, it was nice to get together with those folks, and they had sort of made some jokes about me joining and being like a remote member or something like that. So I thought, oh, I'll just join because it's nice to stay in contact with my friends back there and see what they're up to. Peter Bacure gave a talk on attending the Stellafane Star Party. And I'd seen the Stellafane Star Party article back in the August Sky and Telescope, and had read that. I knew Peter was going to be going down, and it was really cool to see. He and Alan Ward went down, and they were coating people's mirrors. They brought like a mini mirror coater, and it was like this pretty high tech looking gizmo, and they were showing how they were coating people's mirrors like right in the field. Like literally, they set up a little tent,
Hmm.
like a little event tent, and
Mm-hmm.
then we're just like coating mirrors right there on the field, like out in the open. Like it was both, yeah, it was really cool. Like a big bell jar, like this glass bell jar, and then all the machinery inside of it. It was pretty cool to see what those guys were doing down there. And just to hear about the Stellafane event. I think he's been down there at least a couple times before, and I think he even talked to us a little bit about that when he was on the podcast back in February. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's just kind of neat just to see what these folks are up to. And I guess the other thing is, like, I'd recently been to the Saskatchewan Summer Star Party, and so it had reconnected with some folks there, and that's always fun. And I'm like kind of caught up on sort of what's been going on around here, sort of in a way. So it's kind of fun to be able to sort of hopscotch around and see how other people are doing. And the other person who was well, there was several speakers actually. But Michael Wright, who's a listener of ours, he was doing like a Messier minute. He talked about, I think, M11 and some of the other Messier objects, but M11 was the one that really stuck out for me. So actually ended up doing a sketch of that last night, and then he sent me sort of a bit of a preview on some of the other targets that he might talk about in the future. So try to do a couple sketches of those last night as well. So yeah, it's just kind of fun to see what Michael's up to, and he's a pretty good observer and sketcher too. So always neat. And yeah, there's a few other people there. Yeah, just kind of interested to hear what they've been up to. And yeah, and do get back to Ontario from time to time. So when I do, try to stop in and hang out with folks. So it's always nice to have that ongoing connection.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, on to Capricornus. So Capricornus is located between Sagittarius and Aquarius, and first cataloged by Ptolemy in his Almagest in the second century. But I think it was sort of referenced as a variety of different star patterns and constellations by many different cultures going back over the years. Because, well, it's not that bright. It kind of does look like it kind of does look like something. I just really
Mhm.
don't know what that something is, Shane. How about you?
No, that's the best description I have for it too. It looks like something, but not sure what.
I've heard it described as looking like a pair of bikini briefs to
Hmm.
like a Star Trek symbol of sorts, but basically it looks like a triangle that's pointing down that somebody kind of stepped on. And none of the stars are really all that bright. In fact, from here, like last night, I could see the top stars, but the bottom stars were still obscured by the little bit of smoke we had left on the horizon.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's not as striking as some other constellations, that's for sure, but nonetheless, there's interesting things to look at.
Yeah, the ecliptic bisects it. So the ecliptic doesn't quite cut it in two, but just about
Mhm.
kind of runs up through the northern third of it, and then off into Eastern Aquarius. But yeah, I mean, so the planets are going to be passing. That's where Jupiter was in the past couple of years, and where I think Saturn is, just kind of exiting out of. Um, so it is a spot that the planets pass through. But even if you look at the old star charts, it seems like they were undecided on what they would call this. They have a sea goat there, which is a some sort of mythical creature that was associated with Pan, the god of the wild, and with the goat Amalthea, who Zeus had fed. So it's like this sort of mishmash of a creature where you have the goat head and a couple legs, and then looks like the tail of a dragon. I guess it's supposed to be the sea goat. Kind of where the summer constellations of like Sagittarius and Scorpius and Aquila and Ophiuchus, and kind of where they that sort of type of star pattern or type of mythology starts merging with the water type constellations of like Aquarius and Pisces Austrinus, which is a fish, and Pisces proper, and Cetus the whale, and those kind of aquatic type constellations. So maybe they were just undecided. I don't know.
Hmm.
There's some interesting stars there, though. There's a bunch of bright stars in the top right of the constellation, sort of in the northwest. And the reason why these stars are interesting is that they were of great interest to Tycho Brahe when he was doing his stellar observations, and he was able to split some of these, which seemed like they might be impossible. And the stars do form some interesting patterns. Some of them were labeled as nebulae on the first star charts, and simply because they have tight sets of pairs, or even up to say 4 or 5 stars around them. And pretty amazing that Tycho was able to detect something there. But certainly, with the binoculars, you can start to see that there's all kinds of pairs. Have you investigated any of those, Shane? I think you were looking at them once, if I recall.
The delta pairing.
Well, any of those pairings there.
I'd have to check my notes. I may have looked at Omicron, but that might be the only system I've looked at in Capricorn.
Yeah. So Delta is the brightest star in Capricornus, which seems strange because it's Delta, not Alpha or Beta,
Hmm.
even. And this has to do with the idiosyncrasies of the Bayer system. So Bayer in 1604 created something called the Uranometry, which is like really the first modern star atlas. And when he was working through that, he would typically, though not always, label the brightest star as alpha, the second brightest star as beta, and so on and so forth. But there's all kinds of exceptions to this rule, such as, in Orion and in Capricornus. And the reason for that is his rule was actually, it was that if the star was the brightest first star, that was alpha. So sort of like the first star that's coming along through right ascension. So that's how we end up with Delta being the brightest star there. So it's sort of like this weird idiosyncrasies. But Delta has a magnitude of only 2.8, so it's basically like a third magnitude star. So there's probably lots of cities and places on the world where you couldn't see even any of the stars in Capricornus naked eye.
No, no, it kind of goes back to my comment that it's just there's definitely other constellations that are more stunning, brighter stars, more stars, larger area of sky.
I would think this one be pretty difficult to split though, because the orbits of the AA and AB stars are only like just over a day. So I'm not sure if that's even splittable in an amateur telescope.
Yeah, I'm curious what the separation is. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, I think it would be pretty tight. But what happens though as they orbit one another, the system's visual magnitude drops by about a quarter of a magnitude. So that's how they know that they're there.
Interesting.
The system is classified as an algal type variable because of that. Moving on to Beta Capricorni, it's a multiple star system and the second brightest star in Capricornus. So I guess that one kind of sort of does more follow the rules. The primary is named Dabi and is the constellation's second brightest star, has a magnitude of pretty much about just over third magnitude right on. It comes from the Arabic meaning the butcher. So watch out for that star, I suppose.
The B is also an interesting double. It's on the RASC double star program list. The AB stars are quite wide, and they're yellow and blue. And then to the west is the third star of that system, and it's a dark blue as well, and basically kind of forms an isosceles triangle.
Yeah, I see that there's 5 stars in total there, and in binoculars you can even see the binary. The brighter component being beta 1, and then you have beta 2. Capricorn B, and then the two components were known as Dabi major and Dabi minor, and they're separated by 3.5 arc minutes, so they're a pretty good distance apart.
Yeah, I think the AB is probably binocular territory. Yeah, very easily within binoculars.
The Bayer designation for Alpha Capricorni, which is sort of the star, I guess it's the star that's on the very north, I guess, west of the constellation there at the peak of the sort of strange triangle. It's comprised of 2 components as well, but they're not physically related, and they appear 0.11 degrees apart. So again, they're pretty far apart. These ones are really far apart. I think these are the ones that the Tycho had originally been able to subdivide so easy, because they're about the same distance, I think, as Mizar and Alcor in Ursa Major, therefore can be resolved by the unaided eye fairly easily, I think.
Yeah, Alpha 1 and Alpha 2, easy binocular double. There is a third member there with Alpha 1 that is much closer, and they're yellow-blue. And again, anytime you get a star pairing like that has some different colors, it's worth taking a look at if you're observing in that area.
Yeah, I see there's a few other stars associated with this. Alpha 2 Capricorni is the brighter of the two, and the system consists of 3 stars shining at magnitude 3.5, and Alpha 1 Capricorni is about 4.3 magnitude and has 3 dim visual components not visible in small telescopes. Then we get on to V, or New Capricorni, is a double star, appears in the same field as Alpha Capricorni, and has an apparent magnitude of about 4.75 magnitudes. So it's sort of fascinating the way to have all these varying degrees of doubles kind of packed into that same spot in the sky.
Yeah, it's really, really neat. For anybody that is into double stars, it's a rich region. So I'm definitely going to spend some time there.
Yeah, if people are interested in this sort of spot, I would say check out Bayer's Uranometria 1604 Capricornus star chart, and you can actually see some of these are sketched in as fuzzy stars or nebulae stars, simply because with Tycho, I think he was noting that stars that were double could be seen as a nebula for many people. And certainly we've seen that in the early history of astronomy. And then, as well, with some of these other ones, certainly because he was operating about 30 years before the telescope was pointed at the night sky, or maybe even a little bit longer, that certainly some of them would have appeared as fuzzy spots in the sky versus doubles as we know them through the telescope. Let's see. Maybe we'll move on to some deep sky objects. Shane, what do you think about that?
Sounds good.
Messier 30. Have you seen Messier 30? Have you taken an observation of that before?
Oh yeah, 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 definitely. I have my Messier observing certificate.
There you go. You've been certified.
Hmm.
I did all my Messier objects. I think I knew there was Messier certificates, but I did them all before I belonged to a club or anything.
Oh, okay.
So I think I've even sketched most of them now. So I should just run through them and do them. I just keep coming back to my favorite ones and the regions. And I got to admit, some of them aren't too spectacular. Messier 30 perhaps being amongst one of them. Did I look at it? I think I looked at it last night, even just in the binoculars, but it just looks like a little fuzzy star in binoculars.
Yeah, you would definitely need some aperture to start to resolve that.
Yeah. So Messier 30 is a globular star cluster Charles Messier discovered as basically a circular nebula without a star. He found that back in 1764. So I'm not sure if that sort of jives with your observations as well, Shane.
I'd have to go back and read my notes just to see. I don't believe I've looked at Messier 30 in quite some time.
Yeah. It's a globular star cluster. That means it's a grouping of stars that are packed together through the telescope that kind of look like maybe like a disco ball if it was made out of stars, or
Hmm.
like a pile of sugar piled on black velvet. And like Messier said, it just kind of looks like this fuzzy spot. It's easily seen in binoculars as long as the conditions are pretty good. But it's only about 4 arc minutes in diameter, so it's really not that large a fuzzball anyway. It can easily be mixed up with just a fainter star in the general area.
Hmm.
Let's see, what's the magnitude? 7.2. So yeah, you definitely need binoculars to see it, but through a little telescope, you can start to see some of that extension. I think I started working on a sketch last year, but there, you can see like a few of the brighter stars sort of in the outer disk. They may even be like foreground stars or something like that. But yeah, it's reasonably bright in the seventh magnitude, but it's just a pretty standard small globular cluster, very representative of the Messier globulars, if you ask me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Palomar 12. Have you ever taken a look at these Palomar globular clusters? These ones are pretty fun.
I don't think I have.
Yeah, I've taken a look at all the ones that you can see in the small telescopes. Palomar 12 isn't too bad. It's a magnitude 12. You need a decent sized telescope really to hunt it down. Like a good 12-inch is a nice size. Although like only magnitude 12, so it can be a little bit deceiving. Because it stretches across about 17 arc minutes of sky. Like it's a pretty large cluster. It's a globular cluster, but it's super loose in the nighttime sky.
So easy to maybe mistake for an open cluster.
I think easy to not see.
Okay,
Like,
fair
yeah,
enough.
that's probably the best way to put it. Yeah, simply because it's just going to be so spread out. So there's some brighter stars, so you might see those like in a smaller telescope, and then there's going to be like a bit of a hazy background to the star. But some people have tracked down all these globulars in small telescopes, but these ones. Though I think there might be a couple exceptions to the rules. These ones weren't discovered until like around the 1950s or so, using the Palomar Observatory instrument there, which you may know something about, Shane, from your talk last evening.
Yeah, David did talk a little bit about observing from Palomar. I can't remember. I can't remember which comets were discovered using that instrument, but that's an enormous refractor, isn't it? Like a 70-inch or something like that?
It's the Schmidt photographic telescope.
Oh, okay, okay.
I think it is around 70 inch or so,
Okay.
but that's the one they used to discover Shoemaker Levy 9 with that original film that Carolyn
Oh, yeah.
Herschel. Yeah, so I believe that's the same instrument they were using for the All Sky survey that they did with the Palomar.
Hmm,
Um,
okay.
yeah, yeah. So pretty good little open cluster there. Kind of reminiscent in a way of some of the more challenging things, like maybe like that NGC 6888 there, the Barnard's Galaxy. It's going to have somewhat of a same, though much smaller appearance there. I think it might be 17 and a half arc seconds in size. All right, let me get back to my notes here. I do like those Palomar globulars. Like I said, I haven't been able to observe them all. I forget how many there is. There's like 19 or something. I think there's one that's an error, and then there's three or four of them that are exceptionally faint. But I have been able to track down most of the ones that you can see in small instruments. Those are kind of like the two main targets there. But when we think of Capricornus, I think of some of the sort of nearby associated deep sky objects, Shane. I'm not sure about you, but when I'm going to hunt something like M75 or M72 and M73 or the Saturn Nebula, the planetary nebula there, I'm starting in Capricornus. I'm not starting in those host constellations for those targets. But I don't know about you. Maybe I'm just a one-off like that.
No, no, I'm definitely the same. Sometimes these constellation borders don't make sense for finding the deep sky objects within the constellations. Sometimes it is easier to start in a constellation using the stars that are, closer to the object, even though the object might be technically classified for a different constellation.
Yeah. So for me anyway, if I'm going to be observing in this area of sky and I want to observe more deep sky objects, Messier 75 located on the Sagittarius Capricorni border. Well, I'm going to start up by Alpha, Beta, Delta, and then just sweep southwest from there to land on M75. And M75 is a pretty faint. Well, it's not faint. It's a reasonably bright globular, but it's just over there. Sort of, I always think of that as being on the side of Capricornus versus even being inside of Sagittarius. I don't know about you.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Magnitude 8.5 was discovered by Pierre Machin in 1780 and then associated with the Messier catalog later on. Again, it just appears like a fuzzy star, but it's hypothesized that M75 is the last remnants of a dwarf galaxy that merged with the Milky Way some thousands of years ago.
Hmm. History like that is always interesting, I think.
Yeah. Two of the other objects there are, and so that's just sort of southwest. If you think about the very extreme edge of Sagittarius, and then if you look towards Capricorn as well, it's right below those Alpha and Beta stars, and just sort of to the southwest there. So very, very much in the Capricornus region versus over by the teapot of Sagittarius. On the north side of Capricornus is the set of M72 and M73. Have you had many observations of this pair of Messiers?
No, when I did my Messier I can't talk this morning.
Certificate. We'll help you out there.
Yeah, I was going between certificate and certification in my mind and couldn't decide. But
That's okay.
I only really observed this Capricornus stuff once or twice. I think I really haven't returned. And as we're going through this episode, I'm really starting to realize I do need to return.
So M72 is just a globular discovered by Machin again back in 1780, and Messier looked at it about a month later, then included it in his catalog with a larger instrument. John Herschel, who was observing from the Cape of Good Hope, he described it as a cluster of stars of a round figure, visible as a faint nebula in a telescope of 60 millimeters or more. Once you get up like into like that good 5 inch kind of refractor area, then you can start pulling out those individual stars there in M72. M73 is right next door. It's just a handful of arc minutes away from M72. M73 was discovered by Messier in 1780, and he originally described it as a cluster of 4 stars with some nebulosity, which is kind of how it looked like last night to me, just simply because of the smoke. But later observations, again by John Herschel down in the Cape of Good Hope, he couldn't find any of that nebulosity using that 18-inch telescope. So the designation of M73 as a cluster was also questioned at the time, and I think it just ends up being just an association, basically an asterism. I always have trouble even seeing M73 in a way. Like I really have to use a chart to hunt it down. It's really not much to look at, unfortunately.
No, and if I remember correctly, when I was going through all of my Messiers, that was one of the more challenging ones to find, just because it doesn't really jump out.
Yeah. One that can jump out is NGC 7009 or the Saturn Nebula. So this is a planetary nebula up in the constellation of Aquarius, just like M72 and M73. The set of 3 targets are on the northern Capricornus Aquarius border. I mean, they are just barely over the border into Aquarius. And so because of that, typically you're observing in Capricornus the night when you're going to observe these. And there's other targets to look at in Aquarius. Maybe we'll get to those in a future episode. But 7009 is just a few degrees northeast of M73. And this planetary nebula appears greenish yellow in even small telescopes, discovered by William Herschel in 1782. So he was observing around the same time as Messier, just after. And it's one of his earliest discoveries. Basically, the nebula is a low-mass star that ejected its layers into space, forming the nebula. Central star is now a white dwarf with an apparent magnitude of 11.5, so that's visible in small instruments. And the nebula was named the Saturn Nebula due to its resemblance to the planet Saturn. And that was by Lord Rosse using that giant telescope there in Parsonsville, I think, or wherever it was.
Have you ever seen the central star?
I have. So this telescope that I was using is the largest telescope I've ever had the pleasure of spending a lot of time with, which was my buddy Peter's, who I've referenced before. But Peter built a 25-inch, I call it like a low rider reflector, where the light would come in like a traditional Newtonian. In many ways, this still is a traditional Newtonian. It just, instead of being bent at 90 degrees and coming out the side, it was bent at like 70 degrees or 60 degrees, or I guess 60 degrees or something, or 30 degrees. Anyway, it comes out much further down the tube, and then he sort of had finagled the eyepiece in there, and they pointed it at NGC 7009 or the Saturn Nebula one night, and then they all went off for, I don't know if they went off for a beer or something, but then I just sort of sat there because you could sit, and because of the light cone coming out at this angle, it was at a beautiful height just to sit, barely even looking up, as you would just casually glance at the sky anyway. Just a really nice, comfortable angle, and I was just able to sit and look at that for a long, long period of time, and just really take in the Ansay. And in that telescope, I mean, it looked like a robin's egg blue, looked more like what you see in the astrophotos, and you could see like differences in the those what appear to be like sort of the Saturn rings. They call those the Ansay. And you could see like differences in the length of them and in the shape of them and stuff like that. Just an incredible amount of detail in a 25-inch telescope.
Wow, that's incredible. That's a probably an observation that will be with your memory and for the rest of your days, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to get Peter to drag that scope out here so that we can all share this type of observations. So I'm hoping he listens to this. He just needs to retire first or something. But yeah, it's one of those targets that really works quite well with significant aperture. But those guys back there, man, they're building 5 20-inch telescopes right now, and then they're moving on to build like 10 16-inch f3 telescopes or something. Just those guys are just building a crazy number of instruments. It's just wild.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's inspiring, and I would love to look through that 25-inch, but I know what would happen, and that's I would would instantly want one, and then start thinking about how I can acquire.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps. So that's our little bit for Capricornus. I had hoped it would have been clearer in that area of the sky. That was the least clear area of the sky last night. I could only see down to theta. Well, I could see delta, alpha, beta, and a handful of other stars, but basically really seeing much in the way of like M30 or M75 or any of those targets. M73 was the only thing I really had any kind of real look at last night. And, just still too much smoke in our atmosphere, unfortunately. I mean, it has cleared off significantly, but yeah, hopefully the rest of it kind of moves out in coming weeks.
Yeah, agreed.
Anything else to add to this deep dive into Capricornus, Shane?
No, that's everything, Chris.
All right. Well, dear listeners, please subscribe and do us a favor and share the show with other stargazers you know. You can always send us your show ideas, observations, and questions to actualastronomy@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.